dying number of parliament. Good morning, members of the media. Thank you for being here with us this morning, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in online. Welcome to today's media briefing. I am Devendranath Tanku, Member of Parliament for Oakridge West and Shadow Minister of Finance. Joining me is my esteemed colleague Dinesh Rambali, Member of Parliament for Sugarlands West and Shadow Minister for the Office of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs, as well as for the Ministry of National Security. It is our pleasure and privilege to be here as your loyal and responsible opposition to discuss critical issues of national importance. Now, I am aware that for many, discussions about the economy, about government's fiscal and monetary policy and financial management is not a very appealing topic. But these are the factors which determine your quality of life. And when you have a government that is spending $170 million every single day, and you still have citizens dying because they've been waiting on a critical surgery for months, and in some cases for years on a list at the hospitals. When you have thousands of children who have dropped out of school because their parents are unable to afford to buy uniforms or books or pay transport for them to go to school. When you have businesses closing down and citizens fleeing the country because of a fear of crime and a police service that is understaffed and under-resourced. Or when you have local government corporations that are starved of funds to maintain basic equipment such as trucks and backhoes to allow them to undertake critical infrastructure works. And when you have people on fixed incomes like pensioners having to choose between food and medicine. When you have a government that refuses to pay contractors and consultants for work done, executed and certified between 2010 and 2015 only because these works were done under a UNC government, but chooses instead to pay only certain contractors and consultants because it makes commercial sense to certain government officials, then I think we have reached a sorry space. In other words, if you can't make the PNM officials happy, then they are going to make your lives miserable. Instead, the PNM accuses these very individuals of being corrupt, forcing them to seek justice via the courts. And even then, when they receive judgments, they are still forced to use other channels to further challenge the government for what is rightfully theirs. And in the end, ladies and gentlemen, it is the taxpayers like you and I that have to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in legal fees to the PNM-friendly lawyers we all know, in addition to the penalties for the discrimination of the PNM. This is why you need to pay attention to the state of the economy and to government policies and to continue to hold this government accountable for the way that they spend your money. It is the state of the nation, state of the economy that determines the health of the nation. A growing and vibrant economy means more jobs, a better standard of living for all, increased productivity, increased investment opportunities, and more business confidence and growth. More than that, a growing economy means more revenues from existing sources of funding, better prepared to spend money on social support programs for those unable to help themselves, more money for health care, education, national security, and infrastructure development. Despite, ladies and gentlemen, despite the expenditure of over $418 billion of your money, the economy today remains substantially smaller than it was when Imbut and his PNM government took office over 93 months ago. And that is the period that must be used to judge Imbut's management of the economy. Because the economic crisis facing this country today is due essentially to every single action taken by this Minister of Finance and his PNM government from 2015 to now. And therefore we must reject every attempt by the minister to mislead or to engage in sleight of hand and to misdirect our attention from the facts. We must reject the statistical conmanship which seeks to mislead the country with a false claim of growth which every citizen knows to be untrue. We must reject the arrogance of the Minister of Finance and his colleagues who snub their noses at the public and refuse to answer questions in Parliament about government expenditure and solutions to the multiple daily crises facing our citizens. On Friday, the Parliament will be convened to discuss the provisions of what has now become known as the mid-year review. In October last year, the Minister of Finance came to the Parliament and presented the budget for fiscal year 2023. During his presentation, the Minister boasted about closing the fiscal deficit gap and managing the resources of the country efficiently. In fact, the Minister gloated about the deficit being close to balance at 1.51 billion for fiscal 2023 based on government revenues of 56.2 billion and expenditure of $57.7 billion. Having already committed to spend 57.7 billion in 2023, the minister is now coming to the Parliament to seek an additional $3.85 billion for a total proposed expenditure of $61.54 billion in the current fiscal year. To put that into perspective, that is going to be the largest single budget that this PNM government has ever spent. Now, this, of course, means that if government revenue remains the same as predicted, the deficit will grow to 5.35 billion, or a whopping 255% higher than what the minister originally projected. But we already knew, we are already familiar with the fact that government revenue is not going to be what was expected. According to the minister in his budget presentation, the government estimated its revenue, premised on the price of oil in 2023 being $92.5 per barrel and natural gas at $6 per MMBTU. Today, ladies and gentlemen, natural gas is trading at $2.36 per MMBTU, less than half of what the minister assumed in October 2022. Brent oil prices are trading at $79.66 per barrel, or more than $10 lower than what the budget was based on. Obviously then, with lower prices for oil and gas than budgeted, the projected government revenue can be expected to be much lower than expected. As such, a lower revenue would mean that the actual deficit will be even higher than the current 5.35 billion being projected by the Minister of Finance. It is important to note that when I raised this issue in the Parliament about how the government was going to fund this shortfall in revenue caused by falling energy prices, Minister Imbert, in his normal, predictable, arrogant sense, with his attitude of shame and despite for the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, insisted that the government does not use the price of energy that he provided in the budget. They don't use barrels of oil as described that he provided in the budget. Instead, they use a negotiated price based on a basket of product prices. The fact is that the price of oil and gas is significantly lower than budgeted, no matter what the minister's arrogant response is. And so, we wait to see whether the minister will finally come clean to the population, anticipated government revenues, and truthfully advise how this shortfall is to be financed. Is the government going to be borrowing more from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund or from international sources? Only time will tell, but we challenge the minister in his presentation to the Parliament to tell the country the truth that this government says. During the Standing Finance Committee that accompanies the Budget 2023 in October last year, opposition MPs challenged every minister that came forward on whether what was received in the budget was adequate for what they needed to spend on. The records of the Standing Finance Committee will show that ministers admitted what we already knew, that what was allocated in the budget was less than what was asked for, but they were comforted in the sense that if they ran short, they would seek additional funding in the mid-year review. In other words, even at the budget stage, even during the budget debate, it was obvious to every government minister, as it would have been obvious to us, that the government and the Minister of Finance failed to be honest about the anticipated expenditure and knowingly left out substantial, predictable, and known financial commitments which the minister knew were due during fiscal 2023, knew that the country will have to pay these debts, knew that the funds will have to be identified to meet these debts, knew that there will be greater drawdowns from the consolidated fund, knew that the budget deficit was substantially higher than the 1.51 billion he told the country about. But this is the habit of this minister. So ask yourself, ladies and gentlemen, ask yourself, why would the minister not tell the truth about the anticipated expenditure and the anticipated deficit? Why mislead? Why the illusion? I seriously doubt that the government was trying to mislead international rating and lending agencies, because those agencies will have access to the same data and would in any case be very familiar with this government's tendency towards statistical conmanship. Why would the minister come to Parliament, read out this budget speech, and he and his colleagues engage in hours of debate, gaslighting the population that the country was doing well? They already knew that the budget was a farce. Imagine, this minister is now coming to ask money. They're now coming to ask for money to pay for rent for the months of August and September for the Statutory Authority Service Commission. The minister budgeted for 10 months of a year and left out August and September. That is how this minister operates. Imagine after the Judith Jones report found that this government had left innocent citizens, innocent children at risk of abuse. The minister's initial budget for the Children's Authority was 70 million. By that time of the budget, the authority had already established a strategic plan to take the entity forward. But the minister underfunded the Children's Authority to the tune of $62.5 million. That is a shame. When you look at the $313 million of additional funding being requested by the Ministry of Finance, all of it is to pay for outstanding arrears to contractors and service providers. These arrears are items that would have been known by the minister, the ministry, and the government for months and months in advance of the budget, but they left it out, $313 million in arrears. Under several heads, the increased allocations for utilities were noticeably under budgeted. In the Ministry of National Security, for example, Minister Imbert provided a budgeted estimate of $1 million for electricity. The revised version is 550% higher than estimated. For telephone, the increase was 150% higher than what was estimated in the budget. For the water rates, the increase was a whopping 6,700% higher than the budgeted estimate. Security services for the prison service was under budgeted by half. In the case of the regiment, minor equipment purchases were budgeted at $300,000. The additional expenditure being sought now is $12 million. They went from $300,000 to $12 million, 40 times more. In one case, the minister budgeted $2.7 million to facilitate payments to Unicot with respect to outstanding invoices for building repairs and maintenance to the Couva Hospital for the period 2021 and 2022. That's not even the current fiscal year. The increase being requested now from the $2.7 million that he budgeted in October last year, the increase that is being requested now is $73.5 million, an increase of over 2,700%. Ladies and gentlemen, these documents seeking additional funding are riddled with excessive variations like this. like I just described, clearly showing a deliberate trend of under-budgeting in the 2023 budget presented to this country. This is a continuation of the mismanagement of this government, and even worse, it shows a deliberate attempt by the government and every single minister who spoke in this budget to mislead the population of Trinidad and Tobago. You simply cannot trust this minister and this government. Ladies and gentlemen, this increased allocation, once approved by the Parliament, and the government will get it approved because there's a majority vote built in to the way the government operates. This increased allocation will take the budgeted expenditure to over 61.54 billion, as I have indicated, the highest in the last 8 years. And yet, having spent $418 billion by the end of this year, citizens continue to experience a fall in their standard of living and in their quality of life. Now, it is not that this government does not know that citizens are suffering and many have lost hope. It is simply that Ministers Hines, Imbert, Rowley, Gonzalez, Sinanan, all of them, the whole bunch of them, simply do not care. When they wanted your vote, they sang, "We love you, so we take good care of you." And many ordinary citizens believed that this message was for them. But today citizens are learning the bitter truth about this. Today, you learn that minister after minister are recusing themselves from multiple times, year after year, from cabinet discussions because one of their family members is benefiting from a state contract. You know now today, citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, that these ministers only care about the pockets of their friends and families. The government also wants us to focus on specific things. They want to fool the population of Trinidad and Tobago, but I am proud to say that our population is well informed and well educated, and I'm proud to be part of the opposition that is providing information via events such as this to the population so that they can know what the facts are. The government believes that they could fool you over and over and misdirect you so that you will forget the state-sponsored corruption that has robbed taxpayers of billions of dollars annually. They want you to forget that for 93 months, just 3 months shy of 8 years, they refused to implement the procurement legislation. Even after they gutted it and removed billions of dollars in transactions from the oversight of the Office of the Procurement Regulator, whose only role was to prevent corruption in the award and management of state contracts and in the sale of assets that belong to you, the population of Trinidad and Tobago. Even when they gutted that legislation, they still refused to implement it. The Attorney General, a man who was reportedly thrown out of a foreign court for not telling the truth on oath, told the country 1 year ago that the legislation had serious flaws and could not therefore be fully proclaimed. Yet last week, the exact legislation was fully proclaimed without a single change 1 year later. Why then would the minister and the AG hold back for 1 year and not make a single change? Was the minister misleading then, or is he facilitating something else now? Fact, ladies and gentlemen, that you simply cannot trust anything that any representative of this government says. The procurement regulator told us that for every year that this legislation was not proclaimed, 5.2 billion of our tax dollars was lost to corruption. Every year that this government refused to implement this legislation, every single household in this country was robbed of more than $12,000 for the year. That is $1,000 every month of every year for 8 years that this government's mismanagement has cost you. Do the maths, ladies and gentlemen. That's about $100,000 that should have been spent on any and every household in this country. Instead, our citizens were robbed right in front of our face, even while they were suffering and desperately trying to make ends meet. Instead of spending that money to fix drains, roads, healthcare, education, police and fire services, create jobs, that money was stolen from the pockets of taxpayers by a government intent on hiding, covering up state-sponsored corruption. But that is not all. The vast majority of citizens never saw a cent of this $5.2 billion, this $100,000 per household over the last 8 years. The vast majority of citizens never saw a cent, but somebody benefited from this unfettered state-sponsored corruption. That money didn't just disappear. Just like the $3 billion GTL plant and the $1 billion ultra-low sulfur diesel plant that the PNM government bankrupted Petrotrin with, or the $300 million spent by NGC on an obviously foolish project and then written off their books with a stroke of the pen. Somebody, some PNM friend, family, or financiers walked away with billions of dollars belonging to tax-paying citizens, but they want you to forget that. It is not accidental, ladies and gentlemen, that when the PNM is in government, that taxpayers are deprived on billions, they're deprived of billions of dollars, and not a soul is held to account. I note that up to today, not a single government minister, from the Prime Minister to the Minister of Finance, to the Minister of Energy, to any other minister, has challenged a public statement made by then procurement regulator, Munilal Lalchand. I also note that the government waited until the term of office of the regulator had expired. And now, while the office of the procurement regulator has no substantial regulator, now they are coming to proclaim the legislation. I want to draw a reference, I want to remind the population as well, that the term of office of the regulator ended in January 2023, January this year. And despite knowing that term was going to end 5 years ago, 5 years ago in 2018, the government knew that this term of office of the procurement regulator was going to be finished on January 2023. A decision, for some reason, was taken by someone not to ensure that this critical office was staffed by a substantive office holder designed and developed to protect the interests of the population of Trinidad and Tobago and to prevent corruption from taking place. I remind the population further as well, and I take note, and I invite you to take note as well, that the eventual proclamation, the giving of the proverbial teeth as it were to the procurement legislation, seems strangely to coincide with the appointment of someone who was a PNM senator 4 months ago and who will now appoint someone to help the office of the procurement regulator. I cast no aspersions, but I caution the government that we in the opposition will be paying close attention to the filling of this vacancy. We must ensure that no political party hack is elevated to protect the corruption and mismanagement that has robbed taxpayers of billions of dollars under this PNM regime. Ladies and gentlemen, and while taxpaying citizens have been made to suffer, because while corruption is allowed to run rampant throughout Trinidad and Tobago, while corruption sponsored and presided over by the state, this is state-sponsored corruption, while it continues unabated, citizens are being asked to fund the government's wastage and mismanagement by now property tax, increased water rates that are coming, increased utility rates, the tech rates. Those things are coming. Citizens are being made to pay the brunt of the mismanagement of the government instead of the government fixing the problem. It seems ironic, though, that while average citizens are suffering, that certain officials, certain individuals, certain entities, certain persons closely associated with the government seem to be prospering. Yesterday, I read in one of the daily newspapers a very troubling story. That story that should trouble every single individual that is a tax-paying citizen in this country and every single depositor in a certain credit union. That story presents a very troubling situation where a sitting minister of government and a high-ranking member of the national executive of the People's National Movement seems to have become very lucky in his dealings with a credit union. I say no more about this, but I look forward to hearing further details and I look forward to further investigation because it is ironic that a person who in 2015 could not find sufficient funds to pay his bills, a person who in 2015 had to take a substantial loan, can today be purchasing and pursuing extensive properties. But that is not the only example. There is a fact that under the PNM, specific PNM friends, family and financials thrive, while the general population suffer and pay for the mismanagement and misconduct of the population of the PNM, the misconduct of the government of Trinidad and Tobago. I look forward and I hope that citizens will continue to pay attention. The economy, as a definition by definition, is not a sexy topic, but it is what determines your quality and standard of life. Pay attention, citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. This government is on a road of despotism, crookedness, corruption, mismanagement, and cover-ups. And to give you further example of that today, ladies and gentlemen, I turn you over to my brother, MP Dinesh Rambali, who will provide further information on some of these other issues. He is with us.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, members of the media. And let me start off by thanking my colleague, my brother, MP Dave Tanku. I know that a lot of effort continuously is placed by my brother in terms of assessing for the benefit of the public exactly what Colm Imbert is doing in and out of the parliament, because he's quite a sneaky creature.
Absolutely.
When it comes to dealing with this country's finances. So I want to really commend you, MP Tanku, because I know it is a difficult road to traverse when it comes to following Colm Imbert. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the media, citizens all, yesterday the United National Congress celebrated its 34th anniversary. The leader of the opposition, Mrs. Kamla Prasad-Bisesa Senior Counsel, has called upon all parliamentarians to continue fighting for the people and to work to build a more just, equitable and prosperous society. We have gotten our marching orders.
Yes.
This morning, on behalf of all of my parliamentarian colleagues, MP Tanku, myself and all others, and in accordance with the mandate of the Honorable Leader of the Opposition, Mrs. Prasad-Bisesa, I give the assurance, we give the assurance, that we now have a renewed sense of purpose. We are committed now more than ever before to the people of our great nation. As your government in waiting, we are committed to building a brighter future for Trinidad and Tobago. Having already rolled up, as my brother has shown this morning, having already rolled up our sleeves, we get down to the important matters and business of our country in all of our press conferences, and we intend to do no different this morning. I start off by dealing with Dr. Keith Christopher Rowley's coward and obscene attack on our Honorable Leader of the Opposition, Mrs. Kamla Prasad-Bisesa Senior Counsel. I want to say we, MP Tanku and I, hereby categorically and unequivocally place on the public record that the Honorable Leader of the Opposition, Mrs. Kamla Prasad-Bisesa Senior Counsel, is not racist. She has never, throughout her life, and presently does not engage in any racial undertones whatsoever. Without any hesitation, we go further to categorically point out that her engagement in inclusivity in the United National Congress as Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago and now as Leader of the Opposition is unsurpassed by any other leader in Trinidad and Tobago. As Prime Minister, Mrs. Prasad-Bisesa had the most inclusive cabinet in the history of Trinidad and Tobago. And I want to remind Dr. Rowley that it was Mrs. Kamla Prasad-Bisesa, then Prime Minister, that when he was the Leader of the Opposition, she invited him to accompany her to the funeral ceremony of the late great freedom fighter and South African President Nelson Mandela. Ladies and gentlemen, why do you think that was? Because it was a simple showing. Our country, our beautiful Twin Island Republic, was showing solidarity with South Africa, that your deceased dead leader, who had now passed, Nelson Mandela, who fought against apartheid, who fought against racial discrimination and all other forms of discrimination, that here it is in our Twin Island Republic, we were fostering and nurturing that leaders on both sides of the political divide, regardless of race, could come together to join you in your moment of need. That is what it was about. It wasn't for show. It was about showing the people of South Africa that rest assured that your leader having passed, he did not pass in vain. We all embody that, Nelson Mandela, and the principles which he lived by. Mrs. Prasad's Bisesa statement issued earlier today, and I urge the members of the media who are in possession of it, and I take the opportunity to read it, and I crave everyone's indulgence because this is important, ladies and gentlemen. This is a media release dated 1st of May 2023 from the Office of the Leader of the Opposition, and it is captioned, Opposition Leader, I have never in my life accused one race of committing criminal attacks against another race in our country. Not lately, not now, and not ever. Should an apology and retraction not be presented, I will be taking legal action against Keith Rowley for uttering those false defamatory statements and all media houses and reporters who disseminated the said statements. This is the clear statement, very powerful statement of Mrs. Prasad Bisesta. And I want to read it because for the benefit of citizens of this country, she holds a very critical office. One of the most critical offices in this country is the leader of the opposition. And so it is important that we set the record straight. And I now quote from Mrs. Prasad Bisesa. Yesterday in Toko, Keith Rowley showed that he is a desperate and dishonest man whose game is up. I have never in my life accused one race of committing criminal attacks against another race in our country. Not lately, not now, not ever. And Mrs. Prasad Bisesa goes on. Keith Rowley must know that racial tensions can be incited by falsely accusing me of making this divisive statement. It is most irresponsible. It is dangerous and downright nasty politics. It is also defamatory of my character and flies in the face of my many years in politics, where I have always celebrated our national unity and our harmonious diversity. Something, ladies and gentlemen, you recall was celebrated just recently when we had the Eid holiday and Eid sentiments being expressed. Mrs. Prasad Bisesa goes on. They say that who the gods want to destroy, they first make mad. I want Keith Rowley to know that the national community are not fools. They are watching him, looking at the antics of a desperate man. I want Keith Rowley to know that the lie he told about me yesterday will not stand up in a court of law or the court of public opinion. I call upon Keith Rowley to do the right and responsible thing and apologize. He must set the record straight and admit that what was said was false and malicious. I am extremely concerned that some media houses carry that blatant lie without first speaking to me or attempting to get my comments. This is what is responsible journalism. Did these media houses know that that statement by Keith Rowley was false, but still persisted in disseminating it? Therefore, it had a dissemination of those bogus, very inciting statements of Keith Rowley, defamatory, but there was no qualification in those commentaries of having sought the response of Mrs. Prasad Bisesa that her statement could have clearly knocked Keith Rowley's defamatory remarks, untruthful remarks, out of the park. As a matter of fact, on the 27th of April 2023, the first paragraph of a press release issued by myself, issued by Mrs. Prasad Bisesa, states, and I now quote that paragraph which Mrs. Prasad Bisesa put out on the 27th of April last week, Thursday morning. And I quote, "Crime does not discriminate." I repeat, this is the opening statement of her release. Crime does not discriminate. The victims and perpetrators of crime span all political affiliations, ethnicities, religions, social standings, and income levels. No matter which sector of society we identify with, we must have the humility to accept this fact, put aside emotions, and work together for all our citizens. All citizens must equally feel safe in Trinidad and Tobago. I repeat that statement of Mrs. Prasad Bisesa. All state citizens must equally feel safe in Trinidad and Tobago. I go on with Mrs. Prasad Bisesa's press release. The above paragraph was sent to all media houses and unequivocally contradicts the statement uttered by Keith Rowley at the PNM event in Toko. These media houses who pontificate with editorials calling for higher standards in public life, even up to today we read that, should themselves be more responsible in their reporting. I therefore call upon those media houses who replayed and disseminated Rowley's false statement ascribed to me to similarly apologize and correct the grievous harm that has been done to my character and my reputation. That is Mrs. Prasad Bisesa. Should an apology and retraction not be presented, Mrs. Prasad Bisesa will be taking legal action against Keith Rowley for uttering those false statements and all media houses and reporters who disseminated said statements. Mrs. Prasad Bisesa goes on, I wish to remind all of the national community to not let the desperation of a government stir up political strife and hatred at this critical juncture in our history. We are seeing the worst in this government. They try to distract from runaway crime, brazen corruption, laziness, and just plain incompetence. Meanwhile, our sons and daughters in Trinidad and Tobago cry out for justice, jobs, as MP Tanku said, and ability to live and work in a functioning democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, I have just read the press release of Mrs. Prasad Bisesa. Her press release ends, Kamala Prasad Bisesa, Senior Council Member of Parliament for Siparia, Leader of the Opposition, and it is dated 1st May 2023. So ladies and gentlemen, it is important that we understand that what Dr. Keith Rowley did over the weekend is nothing short of tragic. In a small country like ours, where we have so many races coming together and being our brother's keeper, joining in unity and harmony when situations demand, Keith Rowley, at a PNM Family Day, chooses to address those gathered here for the purpose of engaging in family activities and family-oriented events, and choose to go off on a frolic of his own to talk and to pull a very heinous race card. Ladies and gentlemen, there is nothing ambiguous about Mrs. Prasad Bisesa's statement, the one that she issued on the 27th of April and the one that I have read this morning. I want to let you all know that without giving any prominence whatsoever to the two pundits in Arangwes, Mrs. Prasad Bisesa distanced herself and the opposition from those statements. So those statements were issued last week, Wednesday. There is a team, MP Tanku, MP Muninal, Senator Jolene John, and many others, parliamentary colleagues of mine, including myself, who we get together to discuss matters when we deem it to be of national importance, particularly insofar as it relates to racial harmony and harmonious relationships between different groups in the society. Because as a responsible opposition, and this is what Mrs. Prasad Bisesa She lives it. She believes it in her heart. It resonates in her core to unite the people of this country. We met and we spoke about this. And having done so, it was clear that thankfully, one member of the audience last week, Wednesday, in Aranguez, got up and took those pundits to task. The member got up and said, this is a crime forum. We came here to hear about crime. We didn't come here to hear about Tom, Dick, and Harry and a set of Nancy-based, proliferations. And this is what, when we saw that, Mrs. Prasad-Bissessar was of the view, along with members of this responsible opposition, of this responsible United National Congress, that we should deal with it without giving the statement any undue prominence. So without giving any prominence whatsoever to the two pundits, this is where we had a certain train of events which I want to tell you about this morning. So Mrs. Prasad-Bissessar issued her statement last week, and I just read the first paragraph of it. Her statements were followed in quick succession by my own public statements. One on the radio on Thursday morning, 106.5, the host, Mr. Satish Mahabir, and the other was on Friday morning on TV6 morning program, morning edition, hosted by Miss Urvashi Tiwari, Rupnarain. And so this is something that we spoke about. When I spoke on Thursday morning in the radio program, I made it abundantly clear that the central constituencies, and particularly mine, Chaguanas West, we were being plagued by crime. Yes, and I categorically stated that crime was, the central areas were now a hotspot, but that the crime was rampant throughout the country and the entire country was under siege. So I basically indicated from the outset, following on Mrs. Prasad-Bissessar's statement and our own caucusing, that we were not part and parcel of that statement uttered by those pundits and Aranguez. And on Friday morning, when we had the interview with more timing, again having spoken to Mrs. Prasad-Bissessar about this matter, on Friday morning on TV6, I would have indicated categorically that these statements that the pundits made were irresponsible and that we would not share in that statement. And I gave the reasons why. They exercised their freedom of speech. They chose to do so, and we must respect freedom of speech. But we are of the view that freedom of speech must not be used to cause divisiveness. So we asked the population to carry out its own analysis, as we have done. On what basis, on what data-driven evidence were you utilizing to make that statement that miscreants of the East-West Corridor were perpetrating crimes on East Indians? What basis? And we made it clear that we had no such evidence. We made that abundantly clear. We said that. And we indicated furthermore, for what period of time are you talking about? If at all you have this perception, what period are you talking about? What categories of crimes were you talking about that you said that it was being perpetrated by one ethnicity against another? So we really dug down with the hope that the country would have understood that we are not part and parcel of those kinds of divisive statements. As I said, that's their freedom of speech, but those statements are not our statements. But everybody in this country understood that, except Keith Rowley, who went and uttered that garbage. He went and he emptied trash on his own supporters in Toko when he made that statement, spewing such garbage. I want to say these things really make us angry, And this morning, MP Tanko and myself being on the phone with the political leader, she was most upset, not about the fact that it was made against her. She was most upset about the fact that look at where these statements can go, what effect it can have, knowing that now is a time where we must focus our energies on the real problem, which is spiraling out of control, rampant crime, that now you have a race bogey in the game. And that is going to deflect people's attention from where it needs to be placed. So, ladies and gentlemen, as I said, you all will recall those facts. It is out in the media, and it was published. And of course, I have given indications of when even I spoke. Earlier this morning, our colleague MP for Tabakit, Miss Anita Haynes, would have also denounced and desisted, called upon the population to desist from that kind of conduct and behavior, and of course condemned Dr. Rowley for that rubbish statement. Only recently, on a widely circulated video which broadcasted clear racist comments, and again, for the sake of not giving any prominence to that obscene video, I go no further on that matter. But as a responsible opposition, what did we do? We called for an investigation into that video. But I want to ask this morning, why would Dr. Rowley engage in attacking Mrs. Kamla Prasad-Bisesa as engaging in racist remarks and or racist conduct? One newspaper today says that Dr. Rowley did not name the pundit, but the newspaper named it Pandit Satyanan from Arangwes. You know why he didn't name the pundit? Dr. Rowley did not want his own supporters to know that that was the same Pandit Satyanan who is on the public record as praising him, Dr. Rowley, for the fantastic job he's doing in government. He didn't want to tell his supporters that, so I will tell his supporters that. PNM supporters, this pundit is the same pundit who was recently congratulating Dr. Rowley on his recent senatorial appointments. Going marvelous job and putting it out in widespread letters to the editors. So why not? Why you, Dr. Rowley, did not tell the Toko audience about these events? So ladies and gentlemen, I want to move on from that. Dr. Rowley must retract his statements and apologize. I, as member for Chaguanas West, and my brother MP Dave Tanku, member of parliament for Orupuch West, we publicly demand that Dr. Rowley issue forthwith an unequivocal and unqualified retraction of his statements and against the leader of the opposition, wherein he was essentially saying that the leader of the opposition said that, is black people attacking Indian people. She said no such thing. And that he do offer a public apology to Mrs. Prasad-Bisesa. It is, Dr. Rowley, it is that Dr. Rowley is going down a road of divisive race tactics. We accept that we are on different sides of the political fence line. But Dr. Rowley has stooped to a new low, a pathetic new low. In the interest of fostering unity and harmony in our country, in the interest of continuing nation building, the sooner Dr. Rowley issues a retraction and apology, the better it will be for our country, Trinidad and Tobago. I don't end there, ladies and gentlemen. A legal team is already being put together. We have attorneys at law volunteering to come forward to represent the leader of the opposition in a defamation civil suit against Dr. Rowley, should he fail to apologize. So disgusted are persons with his offensive statements. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to dismiss out of hand that rubbish which Dr. Keith Rowley poured on his own supporters and is now being published for wide circulation. The other area which Dr. Rowley spoke about and tried to inject racism in it, as though Mrs. Prasad-Bisesa was promoting racism and inciting people along the lines of race, is when he made reference to stand your ground laws. How long have Mrs. Prasad-Bisesa called on Dr. Rowley to meet that they can speak about crime? 2018? And coming forward, up to last week, Mrs. Prasad-Bisesa made a public call again. Let us get together. Let us put aside political, ammunition. Let us rid ourselves of any ego. And let us work, humble ourselves and get together and work. This is what the country is demanding. It is what the circumstances require. But he will not meet Mrs. Kamla Prasad-Bisesa. And his excuse for not doing so is to come now and inject race into this thing. He referred to stand your ground laws. Rather than meet with Mrs. Prasad-Bisesa, Honorable Leader of the Opposition, to understand what you don't understand, to try and get some guidance where you need the guidance, to try and, to access knowledge which clearly your cabinet is not giving you. You bypassed Mrs. Prasad Bisesa. You could have simply met and you would have understood what is meant by stand your ground laws. Ladies and gentlemen, very quickly, at the recent press conference on the 23rd of April 2023, on behalf of the opposition, I declared that government's incompetence is a public health emergency. In that discussion, you will recall, we in the opposition offered some legal solutions as detailed by the leader of the opposition. These included creating the new criminal offense of home invasion, crimes of theft, or what we call larceny, and crimes surrounding robberies and breaking and entering. We spoke to these matters and the fact that they are currently prosecuted under various provisions in our laws, given the nature of the offense. But ladies and gentlemen, but the violation of threatening or harming people in their own homes is not specifically taken into account. So you have to understand that it will be left up to magistrates and judges to determine aggravating factors, but it is not specifically legislated for on the books. So amending the criminal laws in such a way to recognize these things, amending the criminal laws to increase the maximum penalties for these types of crimes up to 25 years. Furthermore, circumstances surrounding home invasions would be clearly categorized under law as aggravating factors, which the judges and the magistrates would have to consider when handing down sentences. Ladies and gentlemen, the reason behind this is that home invasion will be considered a much more serious offense than what we know to be larceny and breaking and entering and robbery, because the criminals are now not only motivated by robbery, but by threatening their vulnerable victims. Ladies and gentlemen, where does race come into this equation? Where have we said anything about race in this? In none of Mrs. Prasad Bisesa's speeches to the public did anything come up about race or suggestions, whether remotely or otherwise. Nothing came up. So I turn very quickly now to stand your ground laws. If Dr. Rowley would simply sit down with the leader of the opposition and discuss the runaway crime situation, he would understand what is being proposed when we say stand your ground. Dr. Rowley, you are being unpatriotic with your stubbornness by refusing to fire Minister Hines, who is a total failure. That is what we are dealing with here, and that is what it comes down to. You are being stubborn. You are unpatriotic with your stubbornness now. So I get into this stand your ground laws. Ladies and gentlemen, time will not permit us here this morning, but I will just highlight something that I think is relevant. US laws, which Dr. Rowley conveniently cited on his Family Day extravaganza. US laws of self-defense are based on the English common law, which granted the Crown, some may be familiar with that, primary responsibility for defending subjects from criminal threats. Times have changed, ladies and gentlemen. In 2005, Florida decided that they would expand the bounds of self-defense by enacting its own stand your ground legislation. That was the United States of America. A seminal expansion of Canada's, he didn't talk about Canada, you know. So America has what we would deem to be an expansion of the self-defense laws, whereas Canada has what we would call an adjustment to the self-defense laws, and I'll tell you why. A seminal expansion of Canada's self-defense law occurred in 1990, driven by the judiciary and not the parliament, and that case is R. and Lavallee, where the Supreme Court of Canada expanded opportunities for justifiable homicide and do-it-yourself security in the home. So that was in Canada. So you can trace that these countries with their own circumstances started to look at their laws to see how they can better their laws and to be able to treat with the situation. That was Canada through their judiciary in 1990. Then in 2012, so you have the Florida experience, which is 2005 in America, and it's spread throughout all the states. Then you have now Canada's Moose Law, which was 2012. That is what they call it, the Canada's Lucky Moose Law. A 2009 shoplifting incident at the Lucky Moose Food Mart in Toronto's Chinatown provided the major impetus for legal change. So in Canada, they had the judiciary with the change earlier that I spoke to in 1990. But in this instance, the Moose Law was driven by the Parliament. Canada's, ladies and gentlemen, it is very simple. Each country has its own unique circumstances. It has its own population. The demographics are unique to each country. Canada's national and legal culture inoculated itself against the systemic bias and arbitrary outcomes experienced in Florida and other U.S. jurisdictions with their expansive self-defense laws. It is just that simple. You see, in America, they have a system. It is a different system for how they select their judges. Their population is different. They have the right to bear arms. In fact, with their expansion of their self-defense laws, it was being lobbied for by those who, the National Rifle Association and others. So you could see where over there that there were different interest groups that were lobbying to expand the self-defense laws because there was an interest to gain by doing so that guns would be sold more prominently and more expansively to their population. But that is America. They have to treat with their own laws. By the way, what is Dr. Rowley's recent obsession with only condemning America with their gun laws? What is going on with him? But coming back to this point, you can see that America, because of the ethnicities and how they interact with each other, it has contributed to some substantial problems in America. That is a matter for them. Canada, on the other hand, as I said, their national and their legal culture inoculated itself, Canada, against the systemic bias which America is suffering from. And so the arbitrary outcomes that America is suffering from, experienced in Florida and the other states, we are saying very simply that you can have an amendment to the self-defense law which will hopefully have the impact of transference of fear. When these people are coming into your homes, bulldozing your door and coming after you, and whilst one is in one room looting your master bedroom, digging up your safe and whatever it is because a gang of them raping your wife or your daughter, you know. This is the madness we are dealing with in this country right now. So unless we refuse to accept the reality that is the crime situation in Trinidad and Tobago, nothing is going to get better. It has nothing to do with race. It has absolutely nothing to do with race. So whereas Rowley has held on to the U.S. culture and the U.S. system and the issues that bothers them so much, but he has not bothered to look at elsewhere in other jurisdictions to see how they have amended and adjusted the self-defense laws and to create a more appropriate stand your ground laws, he will never understand what is required in law to treat with crime in this country. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is not a promotion of any race or any statement that one ethnicity is perpetrating crime on another ethnicity. There was no such suggestion, whether in the figment of his imagination or otherwise. No such suggestion came about from the leader of the opposition or any member of the opposition. So when we say stand your ground laws, it is because we want to send a signal to the criminal elements, something that you and Hines refuse to do, that we are serious about crime, we are serious about our business in protecting the country. Whereas Rowley and Hines insist that it is not their job to make this population feel secure. Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa is on the other side of the fence for sure. That it is the job of the government, it is the job of a responsible opposition to try to work together with the government to understand these things and to try and get things going in a direction where we will transfer that fear from the innocent law-abiding citizens to those who are seeking to perpetrate these crimes on people who work so hard and just simply wish to live in the comfort and security of their own homes. So what really is going on? It is the Prime Minister's desperate attempt, and I'll tell you, it is his desperate attempt to distract from his own absence. Today's newspaper, ladies and gentlemen, reports some very disturbing comments made by the Prime Minister again over the weekend. So in yet another desperate attempt to deflect attention from his lazy and pathetic performance as a Prime Minister, to seek to distract from his incompetent cabinet, That is why he uttered this, as I said, he spewed garbage on his own supporters in Toko. It was not accidental that on the day, this is what he is saying. He's saying that it was not accidental that on the day the opposition was having a vote of no confidence, which was last week Friday, vote of no confidence in the Minister of National Insecurity, that there was bomb threats to virtually every school. This is what the garbage he was spewing on his supporters. He did them a real injustice, ladies and gentlemen. This is what he chose. Why did he tell them why the reasons why he was missing from Parliament on Friday? Why didn't he tell all those who had gathered in Toko, where was he that a motion of no confidence was brought against Minister Hines? And I got up first and I defended my minister because he just didn't do it and he refused to account to his own people, his own supporters. Why didn't he get up and tell them that at the Toko event? Because he was not there. He has no faith in his own Minister of National Insecurity. And instead of owning up to his own failures as leading a government, he decides that he's going to inject his own racial undertone and divisiveness. Ladies and gentlemen, for the avoidance of any doubt, I want to make it abundantly clear that we in the opposition, we reject any insinuation, we reject any suggestion and or any statement to the effect that the opposition UNC and our leader, Mrs. Kamala Persad-Bissessar, was in any way involved in that act of terror on last Friday. In fact, we were one of the first to denounce and condemn those actions last week. I refer now to a Guardian article titled, and the title is School Bomb Threats Not a Coincidence. I want to say this morning that it is not a coincidence that Fitzgerald Ethelbert Hines is Minister of National Security, whilst all of the national security apparatus in this country is malfunctioning. That's no coincidence. That is not a coincidence. It is not a coincidence that crime has been spiraling out of control at an alarmingly increasing rate since 2015 to date, with the rate of murders having reached its highest in 2022, whilst Hines is Minister of National Security. It is not a coincidence that Prime Minister Rowley has refused to fire Hines as Minister of National Security, and 2023 has already started off bloodier than 2022. It is not a coincidence that whilst Rowley and Hines lead the National Security Council, crime is a runaway train. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not a coincidence that our country is witnessing its darkest times at a time when Dr. Rowley leads this PNM government. I say it is not a coincidence. It is as a direct result of the Rowley-led PNM government's incompetence, ineptitude, and rampant corruption and mismanagement that the country is experiencing rampant crime and poverty. It is a direct result. I want to tell Dr. Rowley that he can go to hell and take his irresponsible statements with him. The population rejects you, Dr. Rowley, and we reject your dotish statements. I want to ask, where was Dr. Rowley last Friday? He was not in the parliament. Was he running from the debate of the no confidence motion in Hines? Rowley was noticeably absent from the debate. And as the head of the cabinet, as the head of the National Security Council, one would have expected a true leader in such a position to come to the parliament and allay all fears following such an act of terror that threatened our schools and our school children and the nation at large. He, Dr. Rowley, should have reassured the nation that everything was in place. All agencies were on alert to treat with any untoward eventuality. Instead, his Minister of National Insecurity, Hines, did not even treat with the bomb threats as an act of terror. According to Hines, he's like, well, it may have been just an ordinary miscreant. So I don't know what information he and the national security apparatus which he wields gave him that information. Ladies and gentlemen, according to the media reports, and it was circulated in social media, the email of terror which was issued to schools last Friday referred to explosives having been planted in schools, motivation of revenge, threats of killing everyone. I don't want to repeat it. I'll just give an idea from the concluding words, which said, and I quote, "No one will be kept alive. Trinidad will bleed. We'll corner you in your house. In the next world, only boiling awaits you. Soon, very soon, a sea of blood will be spilled." Ladies and gentlemen, imagine you are an educator and you are going about looking after children who are under your care in the schools. Principal, teachers, all of you educators, and you receive an email like that. I've just read some part of it. And you now are in charge of hundreds of children. Some of them are 4, 5 and above. And then you have the secondary school students. And you have to now start to marshal all of them to muster points, to appropriately, because you remember these are children. Ladies and gentlemen, like you, I am part of a family. My colleague here is part of a family. Like many of you, I have a wife and children, MP Tanku, and like all of you, I expected something to be done. Reassurance of a train of events which I could hold on to and explain to my children that everything would be all right. How many of you are on edge this morning as you are uneasy about receiving that dreaded phone call from your son's or daughter's school telling you that there's another bomb threat to come and pick up your child? How many of you are in fear that should something happen, you may not be able to leave your work and reach fast enough for your kids? How many of you are like my wife and I, where one person is working from home today in the event that a pickup of your kids has to be undertaken in a rush? Ladies and gentlemen, we in the opposition, we wish to assure you that we are not gaslighting anyone or any particular situation. The email of terror is a matter that can never be underestimated. In the interest of the public, we must raise the following matters and hope that they do not fall on deaf ears, and that whatever racial undertones and stuff that people conveniently see the need to employ, that they can just apologize for it and get down to work. Ladies and gentlemen, national security should have improved cyber security measures, inclusive of better filtering of emails, stronger and more effective firewalls, clear and established lines of emergency communication with police, but also with relevant educational authorities. The government boasts of its response simply because it was a day where all's well that ends well. Do we have emergency drills for schools, for every school, for these type of situations to be mandated by government policy? Again, the government boasts of its response simply because it was a day where all's well that ends well. But Trinidad and Tobago, God forbid, had there been an emergency, what level of preparedness would the hospitals be in? Have they been trained to deal with mass casualties? Is there an existing policy in place? Are there designated hospitals in the north, central, and south? Had this happened in a remote area like Toko, what kind of medical assistance would have been available to them? Had there been an emergency, how would parents of children been informed, treated, comforted? What would have been the role of authorities vis-a-vis the parents? There was a glaring lack of information coming to parents, and I place that on the record. What is the criteria for informing parents of their children's condition? Can it be a priority to communicate with parents even if to reassure rather than only if there were a disaster? Sometimes we see some annoying text messages coming to us, and we want to know, well, why is this coming to us? Because it's coming from ODPM or wherever. And I'm not saying that we must belittle messages coming to us by way of text message from any established institution. I am saying that up till now, we did not get any text messages, right, coming from any of the institutions on last Friday to give us an alert that all is well. We didn't expect you to come and say, well, somebody's in custody, and we narrow it down. We didn't expect you to give that detail as a national security concern. But we expected certain systems to kick in and to make sure that there would be no panic attacks. We live in a country where one person shut down on the side of the highway causes traffic, and it backs up from all the way Claxon Bay coming into Port of Spain. A gas truck turns off, slides off the highway when rain falls, and goes into the island, or goes into a ditch. What happens? Mass panic. People don't know what's going on. So, ladies and gentlemen, these are the things that we must always be prepared for emergencies. Above all, what exactly is the government proposing to do to find the perpetrator of this chaos? I think MP Tanku, you and myself, and along with MP Munilal in the parliament when this was, unfolding, and we had asked for some responses. The point was made by MP Munilal that with matters like these, and we concur with him, the longer you take to engage international agencies, it is more elusive it is to find the culprits. So have international authorities been called in to assist with the technical part of this investigation? FBI, that is not so far-fetched to call them. In the entire America, when something happens like this, they call on the FBI because they have experts there. If so, what kind of time frame are we looking at? So if in fact international bodies, institutions have been called in, what kind of time frame are we looking at? It is a new low. It is a new low when we have to become concerned about the possibility of mass casualties in our nation's schools. It is one thing to be under siege, but another thing altogether when our innocent children are under threat. Above all, what is the government doing to assure the parents that schools in Trinidad and Tobago still remain safe places for the children to be? This morning, I reassured my children that they would be safe in their schools, but I felt as though I was making an empty promise based on the incompetence of Rowley's government. Dr. Rowley's belated attempts of assuring the citizenry came in the form of an attack at a PNM family day in Toko. That was his reassurance. Shame on you, Dr. Rowley. Soon we will hear from your Minister of National Insecurity that he's comparing us to other countries where these things have happened, where these acts of mass terror reign supreme. We'll probably be likened to probably Bulgaria or one of those countries. I end on this particular issue by saying, and this is at the specific request of the Leader of the Opposition, Honorable Mrs. Kamala Prasad Bisesa, that we condemn the email of terror which was issued last Friday to the various schools. Shame on those perpetrators. Schools are sacred places for our children. Our children are our nation's future. Their education is one of the most noble investments which we as a population invest in. Knowing this to be the case, I must re-emphasize that Mrs. Prasad Bisesa was desirous of and did implement laptops for all school children because we invest in education. This is investing in the future. Schools must continue to be safe places that should always be free from terror. Solving these crimes and bringing those responsible to justice should be a top priority for all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, I leave that issue there for now. One of the matters which we wish to raise and which have already been raised by MP Munilal and Senator Jillian John and others is the Brent Thomas case. We cannot emphasize enough what this abuse of power, which was revealed in that judgment of Justice Devendra Rampersad, what it means to our country. The Prime Minister's reckless and irresponsible statements regarding race and last week's bomb threat are not surprising, given what was exposed last week in the ruling over the Brent Thomas affair. This case of Brent Thomas, a firearms dealer who was abducted from Barbados by police to face criminal charges, raises questions about the competence of the entire national security apparatus and the government of Trinidad and Tobago. The judgment by Justice Devendra Rampersad in this case revealed that the police participated in the illegal abduction of a citizen of TNT in violation of his constitutional rights. This is a serious breach of the law and highlights the failure of the police service to uphold the rights of citizens. This serious breach of constitutional rights is part of a clear pattern by the Rowley-led government. We have seen how the Prime Minister interfered in the independent work of the previous Police Service Commission to sabotage the appointment of Gary Griffith as Commissioner of Police. We have seen how this government crafted an illegal indemnity for a state witness in an apparent attempt to influence testimony in a criminal matter against political opponents. Now we are seeing how the entire national security apparatus is being mobilized in the persecution of a citizen and the flagrant underling of his constitutional rights. The Police Complaints Authority, ladies and gentlemen, has opened an investigation, and we are happy to hear that, into the conduct of police officers involved in the case. But this is just one example of many instances where the police have failed to uphold the law and protect citizens' rights. There needs to be answers as to who authorized the police to go to Barbados and use a plane from the Regional Security Services, RSS, to carry out this operation. But it is clear that the government has failed in its duty to ensure that the police act within the law. That is clear. We need answers, but whilst we seek those answers, there are certain revealing things that we must point to. The real issue is that it is clear that the state, the police service, and the government have failed us in this case. The police have acted outside the law, violating the constitutional rights of a citizen, and the government has failed to hold them accountable. You see, this is not just about the Brent Thomas, as an individual, It goes further. It is about the preservation of our democracy against those with dictatorial intentions who are willing to violate the enshrined constitutional rights of any and every citizen. The PCA's investigation into this matter is a step in the right direction, but it is not enough. The Prime Minister, as head of the National Security Council, needs to explain why the police did not act within the law and uphold the rights of citizens. Who authorized this nefarious episode whereby one of our own nationals was abducted without due process of law? I want to most respectfully also call on the esteemed Prime Minister of Barbados, the Honorable Mia Mottley, to state on what basis, why, and on what prompting from the TNT government did Barbados become involved in the arrest and extradition of a TNT citizen from Barbados. As I said, that is a very respectful call from us here in the opposition to the Honorable Prime Minister of Barbados. We cannot allow this kind of behavior to continue, as it undermines the rule of law and it erodes the trust between the police and the public they are meant to serve. It is time for this government to take responsibility and to take action to ensure that this kind of abuse of power never happens. Unless they are so complicit in it, then they need to remove themselves from office. This should not be taken lightly, Trinidad and Tobago, and we must hold those responsible accountable for their actions. Despite the discussions at the recent crime symposium with all the regional leaders on developing concrete measures to deal with crime, the government has done nothing following this judgment and has failed to hold the police accountable for acting outside the law. And again, we have to ask who gave the instructions and how much are they complicit in these unconstitutional acts. This question questions the government's commitment to upholding the rule of law and protecting citizens' rights. And there are concerns that those in power, that they want to hold power, they want to hold the office, but they do not wish to carry the responsibility that goes with it. Something that we learned clearly on last Friday when we debated the motion of no confidence in Minister Hines as Minister of National Security. He wants to hold the trappings of office. He wants to occupy his office. He wants the entourage of security that takes him all throughout Trinidad and Tobago. But he does not want to carry the responsibility. On the other hand, he might just be plain old incompetent. As citizens, we have a responsibility to hold those in power accountable for their actions, and we must demand answers from our government. There must be acceptability from the government on this issue. The PNM, led under Dr. Keith Rowley, is not above the rule of law. An independent investigation must be launched to determine the extent of the abuse of power by all involved. We demand that the TTPS provides a clear explanation for their actions. The government must also take responsibility for its own role in this case and provide the much needed answers on what measures can be put in place with respect to ensuring that this does not repeat itself. Ladies and gentlemen, the silence of the government on this matter is concerning. I want to say that taxpayers' monies will now have to be used to compensate for those actions, for violating the rights of a citizen. And it is of grave concern for all of us that we cannot allow these things to repeat itself. And one can imagine the quantum of damages that would be assessed in that matter, and let alone the cost, the legal cost, the cost of the fees in the matter for lawyers to defend such a case. Talking about fees, I want to quickly go to the case of the missing file. And I want to say that yesterday, the Daily Express carried a very alarming yet appropriate editorial when they referred to the Brent Thomas case as a blot on this nation, a blot on our democracy. Today, the Express carries another editorial, and it's labeled 0.8 million for missing files that weren't. So we are paying $800,000 for missing files that were not missing in the first place. What do I mean by that? This is yet another obscenity. That is charging $800,000 to date to find out what happened with an alleged missing file. The AG said it was sinister. It seems that we are paying $800,000 monies to these retired justices, Ralston and John, paying these monies to them to find an alibi for the Attorney General's incompetence. That is what we are paying it for. And if I am wrong in my assessment by saying that, I want to tell you that according to the practice guide for the assessment of costs, you find this, lawyers will know what I'm talking about, but in the Supreme Court there's a guide for the assessment of costs, and there's a guideline figure for the hourly rate that lawyers charge and that they are permitted to charge when they are providing professional services. So for myself, the rate would be $2,800, $2,850 or something like that per hour if I am acting as a counsel in a matter. For these senior counsels who are the retired justices in this matter, they are of that category. They belong to a band called Band E, and that means that they can charge $4,000 an hour for their professional services. So yes, one may take it that this is not necessarily litigation as yet, but it is grounded in litigation. Their purpose is it may very well lead to litigation, because remember, there is an action and an application which has now been filed to seek to set aside the judgment, whereby the judge ordered that some $20 million be paid to the former accused persons. So it must be that they are charging $4,000 an hour according to Band E, which is permitted to them under the laws. You know what that means, Trinidad and Tobago? It means that we have paid $800,000 divided by $4,000 per hour equals 200 hours. So we have just spent your taxpayer dollars and our taxpayer dollars. The government, AG Amo and Keith Christopher Rowley, has paid all of our taxpayer dollars to cause retired justices to spend 200 hours looking for a missing file. Does that make any sense? We have essentially paid these lawyers who have spent some 200 hours so far to look for a missing file. That is what it boils down to, to look for a missing file. And according to the Express, really, it is a missing file which really wasn't missing. And I just want to read very quickly that what the Express says to conclude. Over and over, when politicians screw up, I mean, that is language that you really wouldn't find in an editorial. When politicians screw up and decide to distract from their mistakes and or ineptitude, taxpayers end up footing the bill for whatever ruse is employed. In the case of the so-called missing file that became the scapegoat for the state's failure to challenge the claim of malicious prosecution by men freed in the kidnap murder case of businesswoman Vindra Naipaul Kuhlman, the destruction is costing $800,000. And they proceed to say within days the missing file, and they put missing file in quotations, turned out to be not missing at all. Even so, the show had to go on. The best that we, the hapless taxpayers, could now hope for is that the gaps in process and management in the office of the AG would be addressed. Well, we haven't heard anything to really assure us of any management taking place in that office. Common sense, however, would suggest that within the combined resources of the Office of the AG and the Ministry of Legal Affairs, there resides the internal capacity to review and investigate system failures and fix the problems of document management. This is something we said from day one, members of the opposition. This, after all, was the heart of the problem that culminated in the 20 million default judgment being levied on the state, adding another financial albatross around the taxpayer's neck. So, ladies and gentlemen, I have gone way beyond what I intended to spend. We wanted to talk about, strictly speaking, crime this morning. We wanted to talk about the incursion into your civil liberties and what has been revealed in that Brent Thomas High Court judgment. That is what we wanted to talk about. We had to spend some time to talk about that distraction, that heinous distraction, that grave injustice that was perpetrated on all the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago by none other than Dr. Keith Christopher Rowley, the Prime Minister, who uttered those words of divisiveness, introducing that element of racism into a discussion where we are all trying to come on board to combat this spiral in crime. So I quickly hand over back to MP Dave Tanku, and we take it from there according to MP Tanku.
Thank you very much, MP Rambali, for that explosive, detailed analysis of the situation of crime and dealing specifically with some of the allegations made, the unfounded and vacuous allegations made by the Prime Minister. I understand you have another issue you want to show.
Just to raise this, MP Tanku knows he traverses my constituency a lot alongside me. News report has now come out, and this is social media. This is the information. Homicide number 202.
Oh, wow.
A man was shot dead outside the Monroe Road Hindu School. Well, they put Karini here, but Monroe Road Hindu School is really in Bhokal.
Yes.
That village. Man shot at the back of Monroe Road Hindu School. Body still on the ground at the moment, visible for all students to see. You tell me what acts of terror these children will have to endure in terms of to get an education. What more? So I wanted to raise that, and I leave you to conclude. But this is really disturbing, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, that also raises another issue which we raised in Parliament last week as well, and that is the amount of personnel the Ministry of Education has to provide guidance and support for these traumatized children, because that is a very frightening experience. I want to turn over to the team to find out if we have any other questions.
Yeah, two questions, MP Tanku. Apart from being Chair of Finance in Parliament, you're also the Chairman of the United National Congress.
Yeah.
As Chairman, will you be issuing any more statements regarding the Prime Minister's claim that the bomb threats originated from the United National Congress?
Well, I think you can look forward to further communication between the UNC and the Prime Minister, especially in light of that vacuous, false and unsubstantiated claim made by the Prime Minister. I thought that the media would know that by now, having had the experience of Emailgate, that you really cannot trust anything that this Prime Minister will say, especially in circumstances when we know that he's trying to distract from crime and the criminal conduct that is now taking hold of this country, where we have a couple thousand persons holding 1.4 million persons to ransom. But the leader of the opposition has already struck back. She has demanded a public apology. She has demanded that the Prime Minister act like a man, and we hope that he will stand up to his responsibility and apologize so that the country can breathe and move forward for these vacuous statements that he's been making, especially in a political forum. The Prime Minister seems to have misunderstood his role. He seems to not be able to understand what a leader is supposed to be. He absolutely lacks leadership skills.
Also, one of the other statements the Prime Minister made over the weekend was his intention to abolish service commission.
Yes, well, that's been the Prime Minister's direction from day one. The interference with service commissions, the attempt to politicize service commissions has been the Prime Minister's modus operandi from day one, and we saw it with the Police Service Complaints Authority, we saw it with the Police Service Commission, we've seen it with several commissions thus far. It is because the Prime Minister deliberately wants political control over every aspect of decision making in this country. The commissions were set up when they were established for a specific purpose, and that was to insulate employment, to insulate various parts of the economy, various parts of the country, various parts of the civil service from direct political interference. But this Prime Minister and this government has deliberately sought to mismanage it, deliberately sought to interfere in the operations. We even saw it with the TTRA, the Revenue Authority, where they were dismantling agencies so that the Ministry of Finance, could put his hand into the operations of the roles and functions that these service commissions occupy. So we see this as one more step in the abuse of office and one more step towards dictatorship by the government.
Abhirami, you mentioned the Brent Thomas affair. Given your knowledge of how these things work, is it possible that the Prime Minister, as head of the National Security Council, did not know about this operation to abduct Brent Thomas?
If it is that the Prime Minister is not aware of what took place, it means that he's totally not in control of his national security apparatus, because those decisions cannot and would not be taken lightly, meaning that it would have to go through several channels at the very highest to say go into another country and bring back a national in the manner in which they did. And hearing, and this is where our colleague MP Munilal would have spoken about the fact that, how is it that you commandeered a jet and you were able, from the RSS or wheresoever you took it, on what basis, who would have been able to negotiate that? Is only the very top levels would have been able to negotiate that, not no ordinary constable on the ground here in Trinidad or ASP or somebody who is just within those ranks of the police service. It had to be done at the very highest level. So if Prime Minister Rowley is unaware of that, it shows that he is in total lack of control of his national security apparatus. And if he is aware, it shows that he is prepared to breach the Constitution, to breach the rule of law, and he will encroach on fundamental rights of his own citizens to do what they did in abducting Brent Thomas.
Another step, yet another step to dictatorship.
And he also mentioned the legal fees with regard to the missing file. So far, the Attorney General has not made public the findings of the report into that missing file. We know that he said that this was a preliminary report and there's another one to come, but given the question of the fees, should the preliminary report be made public at this stage?
Well, I would simply respond to that by saying that from the moment a report, it was made public, and the AG did a photo session, he did a photo op to receive that report, that interim report. We demanded that it be made public because it is in the public's interest. Who is paying for it? It is the public. It does not involve a matter of national security that you are somehow, hesitant to release it in the public domain. That is a report, provisional, interim, or otherwise, whatever you choose to call it, should have been made public. So I'm just reiterating what we said before. Furthermore, that report must have been informing what we are now told is an application on the part of the Office of the AG to set aside the judgment that was delivered awarding the $20 million. So why not make it that those court proceedings are public proceedings? All civil proceedings, unless the court makes an order to seal the file, all civil proceedings are public documents. So essentially they are matters in the public domain. Why not? What is AG Armour hiding? What is the cabinet hiding? Their own incompetence. That's why we're spending $800,000 for these fellas to take up 200 hours of their time to be able to go looking for an alibi for AG Armour. No, it can't work like that. Trinidad and Tobago deserves much better.
Just on that point on $200, based on your experience as an attorney, how much days would that actually represent of work?
Well, 200 hours, 3 days is 72. So you're looking at probably 9 days, right? So somewhere in the vicinity of let's be conservative. You're essentially looking at about a week,
Yes.
a week's work, because you must be stopping for some sleep time and stuff, right? Unless these are really miraculous retired justices that they have the strength and energy, unlike us junior lawyers, to work without sleep, and they work, non-stop. But I think that we can say that they have spent a week in terms of hours in doing what they purport to be doing.
Those are all the questions we have.
All right. Then it falls on me to thank you all very much, members of our viewing audience, members of the media, for your engagement and your participation. Please stay tuned while the opposition gives you repeated comment and commitment that we will continue to do whatever is necessary to hold this government to account and to make sure that someone is held accountable for the mismanagement, corruption, misconduct of persons employed and engaged in the government of Trinidad and Tobago, especially as it relates to ministers of government whom taxpayers have every right to expect better from. I thank you all very much. Be safe, Trinidad and Tobago.